Why did you never marry? Elias Ward had been asked nearly every useful question a man could be asked in Red Willow. He had been asked whether the North Meadow would take seed after the spring flood. He had been asked if a lame horse was worth saving, if a broken gate could wait until morning, if the stage road would freeze before sundown. He had been asked by the banker when he meant to clear his note. He had been asked by old Mrs. Kinney whether he owned a proper Sunday coat. And for years, in every polite and sideways way the town knew how to manage it, he had been asked why a man of 35, with land under him and a roof that did not leak, still lived alone. But nobody had ever put the question in front of him plain. Not until Clara Bennett stood on the schoolhouse porch in the blue edge of a November afternoon, one hand on the railing, auburn hair coming loose beneath a black felt hat, and asked it like she had no patience left for fences that did not need to be there. Why did you never marry? Elias looked at her. He looked at the school windows behind her, glowing with lamplight. He looked at the hat in his own hands, and then he said the most dangerous thing he had ever allowed out of his mouth. Because I was waiting for someone who wouldn't let me hide. The wind moved between them. A mule bell clinked somewhere down by the livery. Clara Bennett did not blush. She did not laugh. She did not pretend she had heard something smaller than what he had said. She only looked at him with those clear, gray eyes that had been unsettling him since September. Then she nodded once, as if he had handed her a true answer and she intended to be careful with it. That was the beginning. Not the kind Red Willow would have understood. There was no dance, no letter tied with ribbon, no moonlit declaration beside a rose arbor. There was a question, there was an answer, and there were two people who had spent most of their lives being useful enough that nobody asked what it had cost them. Clara had arrived in Red Willow on the last Monday of September, when the cottonwoods along the creek were turning yellow, and the whole Wyoming territory seemed to be holding its breath before winter. She came from Street. Lewis with one trunk, one carpet bag, 3 crates of school books, and a way of standing still that made people straighten without knowing why. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a printer and a woman who had run a boarding house through 2 fires, 3 epidemics, and 1 debt collector with very poor judgment. Clara had been raised around ink, ledgers, hard bread, and opinions. She had learned early that a question could be a key, a knife, or a lantern, depending on how honestly it was used. Red Willow had needed a teacher. The last one had left in April after deciding that 30 children, 1 stove, and a roof full of mice were more wilderness than she had advertised for. By the second day, Clara had the stove cleaned, the mice routed, the primer books sorted by age, and the older children drawing maps of the creek bed in chalk on the floor, because the school did not own enough slates. By the 4th day, she had made Jory Meeks, who hated reading because letters moved around on him like beetles, read 6 lines out loud, and not once apologized for being slow. That was when Elias first noticed her. Not because she was pretty, though she was. Not because she was new, though the town had spoken of little else for a week. He noticed her because Jory Meeks left the schoolhouse that afternoon, walking like a boy who had been given back something stolen. Elias had been hitching a team outside the mercantile when the boy came down the road with a folded paper clutched in his fist. "She says I see the shape of words better than I hear them," Jory told him, fierce with importance. Elias had no idea what that meant, but he understood the look on the boy's face. It was the look of somebody who had stopped being ashamed for 1 minute. That was not a small thing. The next week, Clara brought the older children to the Ward place to study the creek crossing. Elias had given permission. He had not intended to be nearby, but a fence post near the lower pasture had leaned just enough to need correcting, and the lower pasture happened to sit within earshot of the creek. So he worked slowly. Clara did not teach the way he expected. She did not stand above the children and tell them what a map was. She made them look at the land. Where does the water choose to go? What does that tell you about the ground? If you were taking a wagon through here in thaw season, where would you place the wheels? The children argued. They crouched in the dirt. They touched gravel, clay, grass roots. They turned a creek bank into a problem worth solving. Elias stood with a hammer in his hand and forgot to swing it. She taught the way a person trains a horse worth keeping, not by breaking it, by paying attention until fear had no place left to hide. After that, Red Willow began finding reasons for Elias Ward to pass the schoolhouse. A harness strap to mend, a book Jory had dropped, a note for the school board, a sack of coal left too far from the door. Every reason was legitimate. None of them explained why he sometimes stood on the porch 10 minutes longer than sense required, listening while Clara spoke about the older children, or St. Louis, or why arithmetic should be taught with flour measures, because hungry people understood numbers faster than paper people did. She learned things about him, too, that he kept 12 brood mares and knew every one by footfall, that his mother had died the wetter he turned 17, that his father had signed away half the original claim in a bad season and then vanished east with a woman from Cheyenne, that Elias had spent 18 years turning what was left into something no man could easily take from him again. She did not pity him when she learned it. That was one of the first reasons he trusted her. Pity made a story smaller. Clara had no interest in small stories. The question came 7 weeks after she arrived. Elias had brought back a geography atlas Clara had lent to Jory Meeks. The boy had left it at the blacksmith shop under a pile of saddle nails, and Elias had rescued it before rain could ruin the binding. It should have taken less than a minute, but Clara was on the porch, wrapping a wool shawl around her shoulders, and she said, "Stay a moment." He did. They spoke about the first frost, and the stovepipe, and whether the older children should learn bookkeeping before spring planting. Then silence settled. Not awkward silence, the other kind. The kind that arrives when both people know there is something in the room, even if the room is a porch and the walls are made of dusk. Clara studied him. "May I ask you something too plain?" Elias almost smiled. "I suspect you will, whether I grant permission or not." That made her smile. Then she asked, "Why did you never marry?" He could have told her the old answers. The land kept me busy, the right woman never came, some men are made for quiet houses. All true enough to pass, none true enough for her. So he said what came. Because I was waiting for someone who wouldn't let me hide. The words startled him after they left his mouth. They startled her, too. But she did not step back. She pressed both hands around the atlas, looked toward the darkening road, and said, "That is a heavy answer." "Yes." "Did you mean it?" "I did not know I meant it until you asked." That was all they said about it that day. Elias rode home feeling as if he had left something open behind him. Clara went back into the schoolhouse and set the atlas on her desk with unusual care. For 3 days, neither of them moved toward the answer. They spoke when town business required it. They nodded when they passed. Red Willow, which had survived drought, debt, and a broken church bell, somehow failed to notice that 2 grown people were carrying a sentence between them like a lantern under a coat. Then the telegram came. Clara read it after the children had gone. 16 words, delivered by the station clerk with the apologetic face of a man who knew short messages often carried long pain. Samuel hurt at rail yard. Hand crushed. Mother asks if possible, come Omaha soon. Not mortal. Need you. She read it once, then again. Her younger brother Samuel was 19, proud, reckless, and convinced no machine made by men could catch him if he was paying attention. Apparently, one had. Clara sat alone at her desk while the stove ticked and the November wind pressed against the windows. Not mortal. That should have comforted her. It did not. Need you. That was the phrase that stayed. By nightfall, she had arranged nothing and understood everything. If she went, the school would close. If she stayed, her mother would face a surgeon, a hurt son, and a house full of fear without her. If she went home too long, St. Louis voices would begin saying what they had said before she left. A respectable woman did not belong that far west. A schoolhouse in a cattle town was not a future. There were families who needed her nearer. And maybe, under all those sensible words, there would be one sharper message. Come back to the life we understand. Clara folded the telegram, put on her coat, and walked out of town toward the Ward place. It was nearly 2 miles. She did not admit, even to herself, why Elias was the first person she wanted to tell. He was in the barn when she arrived, rubbing down a bay mare that had come in wet from the creek pasture. The moment he saw Clara in the doorway, he set the brush aside. What happened? No greeting, no surprise, just the right question. She handed him the telegram. He read it, then he read her face. When does the eastbound train leave? Tomorrow at noon. Mrs. Kinney taught before she married. Her youngest is old enough now to spare her mornings. She can hold the school a week. You have already solved that too quickly. I solved the part that has hinges and timetables. He handed the telegram back. The rest is harder. Clara looked down at the dirt floor of the barn. I do not want to go alone. Elias went still. Outside, a horse stamped in the cold. Clara lifted her eyes. I know that is not a practical sentence. No, he said, it is an honest one. I am asking if you would come with me. She expected him to ask why. She expected him to mention the ranch, the horses, the distance, the impropriety, the town's appetite for gossip. He asked none of it. He took his coat from a peg. I'll speak to Pete about feeding the mares. Her breath caught once. Only once. Then she nodded, because Clara Bennett had not crossed 2 miles of cold road to collapse at the first mercy. They left the next day on the noon train. Elias had been on trains twice, and both times he had disliked the feeling of being carried by a thing he could not guide. The carriage rocked east through bare cottonwoods and open range, then into flatter country, where the horizon looked less like freedom and more like a sentence written too long. For the first few hours they spoke of practical matters, how long Omaha might require, whether Samuel would keep his hand, what Mrs. Kinney would do if the stove smoked again. Then night came. The lamps were lit. The train gathered itself into the dark, and practical talk ran out.
That was when Clara said, "You hide very skillfully."
Elias looked at the window, where his own reflection sat beside hers in the glass. "I have practiced."
"From everyone?"
"Mostly."
"From me?"
He did not answer quickly. That was his answer. Clara accepted it without triumph. "My father used to say a locked drawer is still a drawer," she said. "It can hold letters or dust or a loaded pistol. But you do not know which until somebody opens it." "Your father sounds like a printer." He was. He believed every object was secretly an argument. Elias almost smiled. "My mother believed every horse was secretly a confession." Was she right? Often. The train wheels beat under them. For a while, neither spoke. Then Elias told Clara about the winter his mother died. Not the tidy version Red Willow knew, the real one. How the snow closed every road. How his father began selling anything not nailed down before the funeral dresses were put away. How Elias had wanted to beg him not to leave and had not asked, because the asking would have shown how badly he needed the answer. "I decided then," he said, voice low, "that needing someone was a poor business plan." Clara looked at him for a long time. "That is a very lonely kind of arithmetic." "Yes." "Has it been profitable?" No. That was the first truth the train took from him. It would not be the last. By the time they reached Omaha, Clara knew more about Elias Ward than Red Willow had learned in 18 years. And Elias knew the thing Clara had not said when she showed him the telegram. She was afraid that going home would turn her into the person everyone there remembered. Useful, capable, obedient to need. A woman who could be proud of her work only after everyone else's life had been steadied first. The Bennett house stood behind the print shop on a street that smelled of coal smoke, wet boards, and ink. Clara's mother, Ruth Bennett, opened the door before they knocked. She was a narrow woman with sleeves rolled to the wrist and worry held so tightly in her jaw it looked carved there. She took Clara in both arms. Then she looked over Clara's shoulder at Elias. For 1 second, the room changed temperature. "Mr. Ward," Clara said, before anyone could invent an explanation, "this is my mother. Mother, Elias came so I would not have to travel alone." Ruth Bennett's eyes measured him with the speed and accuracy of a woman who had priced paper, borders, and men's promises for 25 years. "That was decent of you." "No, ma'am," Elias said. "It was selfish. I wanted to be useful to her." Ruth blinked, then moved aside. Samuel was upstairs, pale with pain and fury, his right hand wrapped so heavily it looked like it belonged to someone else. He tried to joke when Clara entered. He failed halfway through. She sat beside him and held the uninjured hand without asking whether he wanted her to. Elias stayed by the door until Samuel noticed him. "You're the rancher?" "Yes." "Are you courting my sister?" Clara closed her eyes. Ruth said, "Samuel?" But Elias answered, "I am trying to become the kind of man who could." That silenced the room. Even Samuel, who under ordinary circumstances loved a sharp remark more than wisdom, had no immediate weapon for that. Over the next 4 days, Elias fixed a broken porch rail, carried coal,
read newspaper columns aloud when Ruth's eyes grew tired, and sat with Samuel through the long, ugly hours when pain made him ashamed of needing help. He did not perform goodness. That was what Ruth noticed. He simply saw work and entered it. On the fifth evening, Clara found her mother in the print shop, standing over a locked form of type that had been abandoned mid-page. Ruth did not turn around. "You could stay." Clara had known the sentence was coming. It still struck hard. "Samuel will need months." "I know." "The shop is behind." "I know. And that town has known you 7 weeks. Clara stared at the rows of metal letters waiting to be inked. "They know the work I am doing." Ruth turned then, and the tiredness in her face was not accusation. That made it worse. "I am not asking because I think your life there is small. I am asking because this one is heavy." Clara had no answer that did not wound somebody. That night she stood in the hallway outside Samuel's room and heard him talking to Elias. "My mother wants her to stay." "I expect she does," Elias said. "Do you?" A pause. Then Elias said, "I want Clara to be wherever she can breathe." Samuel was quiet. "That is a stupidly noble answer." "It is the only one I have." "No," Samuel said. "It's the only one that doesn't make a cage and call it love." Clara put one hand over her mouth and stepped back before either man could see her. The next morning, Samuel asked for paper. With his left hand, slowly, angrily, he wrote a letter to the Red Willow School Board. Clara tried to stop him twice. He ignored her both times. It took him 40 minutes to write 6 crooked lines. "Mrs. Kinney can keep order. Miss Bennett should not lose her school because my hand was foolish. She is needed there. I am needed here, but not like that." At the bottom, with exhausted pride, he added, "Also, I am learning left-handed." Clara read it and cried for the first time since the telegram. Not loudly, not long. But Elias saw it and did not come closer, because some grief asks for arms and some asks for room. 2 days later they boarded the westbound train. Somewhere beyond the Missouri River, Clara said, "You told Samuel you wanted me where I could breathe." "I did." "Did you mean Red Willow?" "I meant wherever the answer is true." "And if it is Red Willow?" "Then I will be grateful." "And if it is not?" Elias looked at his hands. They were scarred, square, made for reins and rope and repair, not for holding anything delicate. Yet on that train, with winter fields sliding past the window, he reached across the narrow space between them. He did not take Clara's hand. He offered his. That mattered. Clara looked at it. Then she placed her hand in his, like she had been making that choice for longer than either of them knew. "It is Red Willow," she said. The train carried them home. Red Willow had changed while they were gone, because towns do that when they are given 2 weeks and a little uncertainty. Mrs. Kinney had kept the school open, mostly by threatening the older boys with extra grammar if they tested her patience. Jory Meeks had continued reading, not gracefully, not quickly, but steadily. When Clara stepped down from the train, he was waiting near the freight platform with a folded page in his hand. "I wrote it without my sister helping," he said, staring at the ground. Clara unfolded it. The letters were uneven. Some leaned like tired fence posts.
but they held. It was a map of the creek crossing, labeled in Jory's careful hand. Gravel here. Clay here. Wagon wheels sink here in thaw. At the bottom he had written, I can see words better now.
Clara pressed the page to her chest. Yes, she said. You can. Elias watched the boy walk away, trying very hard not to run, and something settled in him with such force that he almost missed his own breath. This was what Clara did. She did not make people depend on her. She made them stand straighter inside themselves. A month later, the school board discovered a new concern. Not the mice, not the stove, not the leaking roof. Marriage. More precisely, whether a married woman ought to remain teacher if the town's most eligible horse rancher finally found the courage to ask her. No proposal had been made yet. This did not prevent the board from worrying in advance. Red Willow had always been efficient about other people's lives. The meeting was held in the church basement during a sleet storm. Farmers, mothers, 2 cattle buyers, 1 blacksmith, and 11 restless children crowded between stacked hymnals and sacks of flour donated for the poor. Clara sat in the front row. Elias stood at the back. He wanted to speak first. He did not. That was another kind of love, though he did not have the word for it yet. The board chairman cleared his throat and said a woman with household obligations might not be able to give the school her full attention. Clara stood. The room quieted before she opened her mouth. I have 32 pupils, she said. 6 cannot read at grade. 14 work before sunrise. 8 come without breakfast at least twice a week. 1 boy sees letters differently than the rest of you, and for 3 years he was treated as if effort would cure what shame had caused. Jory went red to the ears. Clara did not look at him, which was a mercy. I'm not asking this town to approve my private life. I am asking whether you want a teacher who knows the names of the children sitting in front of her, or a rule that lets you feel orderly while they fall behind. The sleet tapped the basement windows. Then Elias stepped forward. Every head turned. He removed his hat. If Clara Bennett ever marries me, he said, I will not be gaining a woman who belongs less to this town. I will be joining my life to a woman whose work has already changed it. He looked at the board. If that troubles you, the trouble is not her marriage. It is your imagination. Mrs. Kinney laughed once, very loudly, and then covered it with a cough that convinced no one. The vote passed 20 minutes later. Clara would continue teaching. The roof would be repaired before Christmas, and Jory Meeks would receive a proper slate because his map had somehow become evidence in a matter larger than handwriting. Elias proposed the next evening, not in the church basement, not in front of the town, on the schoolhouse porch, where the first true question had been asked. Snow lay thin over the yard. The stove inside was still warm. Clara stood where she had stood in November, shawl drawn tight, eyes steady. Elias took off his hat. I've been trying to decide how to ask this properly. That sounds unlike you. I am trying to improve. Proceed, then. He laughed under his breath. Then he grew serious. I do not want to give you a smaller life. I do not want to be another person who needs you so badly that he forgets you are a person and not a remedy. Clara's face changed. He stepped closer. I want to build a life where you can breathe. If you believe that life can include me, I would count it the finest mercy I ever had." He had planned to kneel. He forgot. Clara noticed. She did not care. "Ask the question, Elias." "Will you marry me?" "Yes." She said it before the last word had fully left him. Then she smiled. "And for the record, you may still kneel if you feel cheated of ceremony." He did then, partly because it was proper, mostly because his legs had become unreliable. They married in April of 1888, when the creek ran high with snowmelt and the whole town smelled of mud, horses, and bread. Ruth Bennett came from Omaha with Samuel, whose right hand would never close the same way again, but whose left had become stubborn, useful, and surprisingly elegant. Samuel brought Clara a wedding gift, a printed broadside from the Bennett shop set in type he had locked himself. It read, "A school is not a room, it is a door." Clara framed it and hung it inside the schoolhouse, where every child could see it. Years passed in the ordinary way, which is to say, not ordinary at all when you were living them. The Ward place gained a second barn and lost 2 roofs to wind. Clara taught 3 generations of Red Willow children to read maps, ledgers, weather, contracts, and themselves. Elias learned that being needed did not have to mean being trapped. Clara learned that independence did not have to mean standing alone in every doorway. Their son was born during a thunderstorm. Their daughter, 3 years later, arrived quietly at dawn, as if she had already studied the household and chosen the least dramatic entrance. On a summer evening, many years after that first question, Elias came in from the upper pasture and found Clara on the porch with their daughter asleep against her side. An old page lay open on Clara's lap. Jory Meeks's creek map, the one with the uneven letters. Gravel here. Clay here. Wagon wheels sink here in thaw. Elias sat beside her. For a while they listened to the insects and the creek beyond the cottonwoods. Then Clara said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had not asked?" Elias looked toward the schoolhouse light at the end of the road. "Often." "And?" He took her hand. "I think I would have lived a useful life." Then he looked at her. "But not an honest one." Clara leaned her shoulder against his. That was the whole truth of it. A woman asked the question nobody else had dared to ask. A man answered without hiding. And an entire life opened from the place where the hiding stopped.